Question: how should we understand validity? Now, it turns out that validity is a central concept in this course. You might even make the case that it is the central concept of the course, as some have defined logic as the study of validity. In any case, what we need to focus on here is that this is one of those concepts that it isn't really enough to merely memorize the definition. Validity is a concept that you must calibrate. You must hone in your understanding of this idea. So let me try to do that for you in this video. Let me begin with maybe an obvious point, but something that seldom is made explicit in introductory logic courses, but it is very important. So first things first, validity is a property of arguments, not of sentences. In your everyday parlance, you might say things like, that is a valid point, or that is a valid claim. In this course, that is not allowed. Our conception of validity is such that it only applies to arguments. In particular, it only applies to deductive arguments, and even, honing in even more, it only applies to those deductive arguments where the premises force the conclusion on you. So our usage of the concept of validity is very, very particular. So we have to be careful with that. It only applies to arguments. Having said that, let me introduce the concept of truth. I'm sure you've already heard of it. We're going to distinguish this from validity later, but notice right off the bat that here is one important distinction. Truth is a property of sentences. In particular, it's a property of the thought behind declarative sentences. So I won't get too much into this whole idea of thoughts behind sentences now. We will do that later. But for now, notice that declarative sentences are the only ones that you can say are either true or false. Like, you can't say the question is true. What if you were to ask someone, hey, what time is it? And they were to say false. That wouldn't really make sense, right? So it turns out that it's only the case that sentences that describe some set of affairs, in other words, declarative sentences, those are the only ones that you can appropriately label true or false. So right off the bat, validity and truth are different, right? They apply to different things, one to arguments and the other to a particular type of sentence. Okay, with that out of the way, let's think about validity in different ways. One way to think about validity is to think of it as a matter of logical consistency. So just to remind you of what logical consistency is, two or more statements are logically consistent if it is possible that they are all true simultaneously. Logical consistency happens to be one of those concepts that you also need to calibrate a little bit before you really understand it. So hopefully we did that last time, but just notice real quick, just to make sure, that logical consistency isn't saying that the statements are actually true, just that it is possible that they are all true at the same time. So that's very important to keep in mind. Do they contradict each other in any way? No? Excellent. Then in that case, the statements are logically consistent. So logical inconsistency is as follows. Two or more statements are logically inconsistent if it is not possible that they are all true simultaneously. Something about the statements jointly is contradictory. One contradicts another, right? So in that case, the set of statements can't be consistent. They're inconsistent. So with that out of the way, with that quick little reminder of what logical consistency is, you really can think of validity in terms of logical consistency. For example, An argument is valid if it would be logically inconsistent to believe the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. There is just something irrational and inconsistent about taking a look at a valid argument and then saying, well, the premises are true, but the conclusion is not true. That just doesn't make any sense. So let me give you an argument, and maybe this will be easier to think about. So think about it. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, this is a valid argument. And notice, if you believe 1 and 2, it would be irrational of you to not believe 3, right? If you believe the premises, it would simply be inconsistent of you to not also believe the conclusion. So that's thinking about validity in terms of inconsistency and consistency and inconsistency. So that's one way to think about it. Before I move on, I really want to give you a quick pop quiz just so you kind of see how this goes. I love doing this kind of stuff, by the way. So let's just make sure you have this idea down. Check the following for logical consistency. So here are your statements. 1. Gender plays no role in mathematical ability. 2. All competent mathematicians are male. Think about it. Pause if you need to. Let me ask the question a little bit differently. Is it possible that these two statements are true at the same time? So it turns out these two statements are actually consistent. And I'm also guessing that you think they're inconsistent. So here is my face of disapproval. Think about it again. Look at them. I know, well, before I even say that, do they contradict themselves in any way, or do they contradict each other in any way? Look very carefully at the wording. They actually don't. Is it possible that they're both true at the same time? Maybe. Now, if you can't think of how yet, I'll give you an example in a second. But this is such an important point that I'm going to go ahead and literally write out what I'm going to say. I'll add to it, I guess. But this is pretty important, so let me read this from the slides. This set of sentences is technically consistent. What some people have trouble with, and this is a reason why I love the question, is that the second statement is blatantly false. Of course, the statement's actually being true has nothing to do with its consistency with the other statement. Does that make sense? So let me pause there. A lot of people, for some reason, when I ask them, hey, is this set of sentences consistent? What they answer is the question, are they both true? That's not what I'm asking, though. Can they be true at the same time? Just because you see one sentence that's for sure not true, that doesn't mean they can't be consistent, right? So really think about that for a second. Let me add some things here. As an aside, I think that you probably do currently understand logical consistency, but that we definitely activated some emotional parts of the brain by bringing up gender like that. It's probably too emotionally charged of an issue to be objective about. So maybe I'll pull a trick like that on the test, right? But so let me say two things here about this. I mean, let me just give you an example of when these might both be true at the same time. Just imagine, ancient Greece, where there really was no avenue for women to play a consistent and important role in intellectual matters. In that case, it would have been true that gender plays no role in mathematical ability, but that none of the competent mathematicians were female. Now, it has nothing to do with the actual gender and mathematical ability part. It just happens to do more so with society at that time. So that's one thing I want to say. I mean, you really have to kind of dig and see, well, is there any way this could be true? And there is a way it could be true, right? That's one thing. But the second thing I want to say here is that logical consistency, much like validity, you really do have to calibrate it and focus when you're doing this, because even a little trick like the one that I played on you right now might affect your assessment of a statement's logical consistency. In a way, logical consistency is basically a much lower bar than what many people initially conceive of it. It just means, can they be true at the same time? Not that they're actually true, but can they be true? So definitely watch out for my tricks, my bringing up politically loaded statements, right? So watch out for that. But nonetheless, really think about this as a learning opportunity here. I mean, you really do have to hone in your conception of consistency, just like we're doing with your conception of validity. Okay, so let's also think of validity in another way, and I think this is a good one for a lot of people. There's an extra step, but I think it's worthwhile. So one can also think about validity in terms of degrees of possibility. For example, there are physiological impossibilities, right? So given our human physiology, some things are possible, some things are impossible. For example, if you ever watched that god-awful movie, Junior, where Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of California, played a pregnant male, you know that's not possible, right? Given human physiology, that's simply not possible for us. This is not to say that it's impossible in general, if you are not aware of it. There are some species, for example, I can think of some fish that do this, that actually change their gender given the situation. If there are too few females, they actually change, some males change to females so they can bear children. You know, that's kind of strange, but so a physiological impossibility for humans isn't an impossibility in general, right? So that's one degree of impossibility. Let's go a step higher. Let's think about physical impossibilities. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're a human or a fish. Some things on this planet are simply physically impossible, right? If you ever played that game, it's pretty old for you, but Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, you know that most of that's not possible, right? Or how about something like this? You know that if you look at this long enough, there is something not possible going on here. The only way that this image is even, can be really made is essentially through the blurring method that plays kind of an optical illusion on you here. So some things are just physically not possible in our universe. But I might add that physical impossibilities, if you read people like Brian Greene and Max Tegmark, they say that there's actually parallel universes where, the laws of physics might be different. So physiological impossibility is one degree of impossibility. Physical impossibilities is another higher degree of impossibilities. You literally have to go to another parallel universe, apparently, to make it so that some of our physical impossibilities are possible. But there's a third, even greater degree of impossibility. And these are conceptual impossibilities. So it doesn't matter what species you are, human or fish or whatever, or what parallel universe you're in, some things are just simply conceptually impossible. So what does that mean? A conceptual impossibility is an action or event that it is impossible to conceive of or imagine actually happening. If you need an example of this, take a look at the drawing here by Escher. I mean, if you don't know, M.C. Escher is kind of an expert in doing these kind of things, was an expert in doing these things. And it's beautiful, but if you look long enough, you'll figure out that's not possible. That's simply, there's clearly either an optical illusion going on or it's only possible in 2 dimensions. So that would be something you can't really conceive of actually happening. Maybe you can think of other things that are better than this image. But if you have that notion down of something that you can't even think of, that's another way to think about validity. So An argument is valid if and only if it is conceptually impossible for its premises to be true, while its conclusion is false. So this is just another way of thinking about it. We won't be using this definition technically throughout the course, but it does allow you to think about how it is that validity relates to impossibility, conceptual impossibility. So let me give you here a quick objection that I've heard before, just to kind of take care of this right now. But one might say that they can imagine anything, so anything is conceptually possible. I don't know how to say this. They're wrong. So think about this. Think about a square triangle. Can you do it? My guess is that either you're thinking of a square, if you think you're doing it, either you're thinking of a square or a triangle, but you can't synthesize these concepts. By definition, you cannot synthesize a square and a triangle. So thinking of a square triangle is conceptually impossible. Same thing with a married bachelor. Either you're married or you're a bachelor, and these are mutually exclusive categories. So this, again, if you're thinking about a married bachelor, well, you're not. You're either thinking about someone that's married or a bachelor. It is conceptually impossible to conceive of a married bachelor. So if you want to think about conceptual impossibilities in terms of contradictions, that makes perfect sense. The concepts of married and bachelor are inconsistent. They're contradictory, right? So that's, that takes care of that objection. I mean, it's an easy matter. No, there are some things that are conceptually impossible, and we can think of validity in terms of that. So, okay. So let's return now to the matter of distinguishing truth and validity. So if I want to kind of summarize everything we've said so far, validity is only concerned with the logical relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Validity only cares if, basically it applies only if the premises necessitate the conclusion. That's the only situation where validity applies. If you're thinking about truth, right, if you're even looking into that actual truth, then you're kind of digging for soundness, right? So that little Venn diagram there should kind of help, clarify that. Too many times when I ask if an argument is valid, students essentially try to answer the question, well, is every sentence there true? That's not what I'm asking. All I'm asking is, if the premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? So let me give you an example here. All right. Premise 1, if you have a beard, then you are a time traveler. Premise 2, RCG wears a beard. And by the way, RCG are my initials that I go by sometimes. 3, therefore, RCG is a time traveler. Well, assess this argument for validity for me. Is it valid? Think about it. Pause if you need to. This argument is actually valid. Premises 1 and 2 do force number 3 on you. So it really is the case that this is a valid argument. However, there's something wrong with it, right? And that's, you're right. It's not sound. Essentially, what that means is the premises aren't all true. In this case, premise 1 is definitely not true. Why would having a beard make you a time traveler? That doesn't make any sense, right? So that's for sure not true. And premise 2, I mean, sometimes it's true. I sometimes have a beard, sometimes I take it off, whatever, right? So what's going on here, that's a picture of me without a beard. So what's going on here, though, is that you have to be able to distinguish between when an argument is valid or invalid, and then that next level, which is sound or not sound, unsound. So that's a very important distinction to make. And although we're going to focus on validity in this course, it's a general habit of a critical thinker to be able to distinguish between those two concepts. So let me just give you one last little bit of warning here. Your homework part of your homework is to memorize some of these terms, but again, it really isn't enough to just memorize the definitions. You really do have to kind of calibrate these concepts and be able to apply them, maybe come up with samples or examples of them, and then you'll truly understand them. So I guess that's the main lesson for today, right? So it's not enough to memorize. Really try to think of examples to calibrate these concepts.